think a lot of people think this is actually what philosophy has come to the conclusion of after 2,000 years, is that there's no such thing as the truth. There are only different points of view. And there's this idea that there are, a huge number of different perspectives. We come on days like these to hear them all and suggest that some are true and others are false, that some might be better than others, is somehow elitist or dogmatic, totalitarian, whatever it might be. Pick your egalitarian insult of choice. There's something kind of seductive about this idea. It has a kind of the air of a kind of democratic pluralism. But I think it is ultimately an unsustainable one. It leads, if you take it too seriously or too literally, to a kind of sloppy, sludgy, anything-goes relativism. And no one really believes that. I mean, if I was to say to you now, my belief is that, the TED organisation is run by a load of intergalactic lizards in a conspiracy or something. Actually, there are some people who do believe that. Now, you might say I'm entitled to my opinion, but hopefully that doesn't mean you think this opinion is any good. In saying that respecting my right to believe what I do is really respecting my right to be bonkers. It's not really giving any credence to the belief. But nonetheless, I think there is something at the heart of this idea which is touching on, it's getting right. So it's not the case that there's no such thing as the truth. There are only different points of view. But it is the case that there are many different points of view, and it's the sort of totality of the true such points of view which is the truth. So the truth is nothing more than a collection of those things. This idea is a very simple one in lots of ways, but it's often misunderstood, misused. And it's important for all sorts of things, including how we view ourselves, and I'll come to that later. But first of all, I just want to give a couple of examples of what happens when you get too beholden to one particular point of view. Now, here's, let's say, two short examples. This is a survey I did many years ago. It's an online survey, so it's self-selecting. So it's not really claiming to be representative of the population as a whole. But nonetheless, that wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in what we could look at if we took the people who answered and divided between them. So I asked people what they complained about. I gave them various options. This was the top 10 they came up with. Now, let's do the obvious thing. Let's see if it makes any difference whether it's male or female. So the men, they complained mainly about things like ineffective politicians and poor service and public transport. When you asked women, however, significant differences. Tended to complain more about the cost of living and spouses, and partners and friends, and also weather, funny enough. They complained a lot less about television. I don't know what that tells you. Now, there you go. This is a very straightforward thing. It seems to show very significant gender differences. Aha, boys will be boys, girls will be girls, etc. Let's take another quick example. This was something which was like an online thought experiment. Ex-colleague of mine does this. People go and they engage in these thought experiments. He described, thousands of people have done this. He describes to them a very particular situation, a very particular scenario, and asks people for their judgment in this particular scenario. And in this situation, he asked whether it was morally wrong to have sex in the situation where the partner will come to regret it, or whether it was morally wrong to have sex if the partner was intoxicated, albeit cogent, and would not have had sex otherwise. And lo and behold, well, this is what happens with the male answers. 57% thought the first action would be wrong, 71% the second. And in the second case, 68% of the women thought it was wrong and 80%. Now, with the large numbers of people taking part in this survey, this is a very highly statistically significant difference, okay? Now, I'm not, for today's purposes, concerned with the validity or interpretation of these two particular examples I've given. I mean, they might be deeply flawed as experiments, but that's not really the point. We all know about this kind of thing. There was lots of different studies done, many of them much more scientific and rigorous than this, which show these systematic differences in the tendencies of responses and actions, behaviours, beliefs, whatever, of men and women. And a lot of people, some people don't really like these results and they want to challenge them. And the answer comes back, well, I'm sorry, you can't just oppose this because you don't like it or you has an ideological objection. Facts are facts, data's data, you just got to live with it. Now, to a certain extent, that's actually right. A lot of the time, there is nothing wrong with the data, although it has to be said there is still quite a lot of dodgy data out there. But that doesn't mean there's no problem with this kind of thing. The problem with this kind of thing, though, is not that it's saying anything false. The data usually is perfectly sound, the conclusions are sound. The problem is that in each case what's happening is we're looking at only one small part of the picture. And if you can't see how a part of the picture fits into the whole, then you may as well be squinting at it, no matter how clear that part appears to you. So this is the sort of image I want to work with here. It's the idea that, and a familiar one I think, that people will say, we always look at the world through some kind of lens. That's something we're used to hearing. And sometimes people think, well, what that means is that we never really see the world as it is. We always see the world distorted in some way. I think that's the wrong way of reading that lens metaphor. Rather, what happens when we look through a lens is, if it's a good one, is that it will bring something of the world into sharp focus and make it clear to us. But almost invariably, it does so at the expense of other things which are either out of the frame altogether or blurred. So, I mean, simple analogy here. This is a picture of a keyboard, and with the lens we're looking at it here, the foreground, the end of the piano here is in completely clear focus, but the rest is blurred. You can then change the settings or change the focus. Different parts become into sharp focus, and at the end, it's the end which is in focus and the foreground which is blurred. Now, in each case, there isn't a distortion in the sense that that part of the picture which is perfectly in focus is as it is. There's no falsehood there. The only way in which the image is misleading is that what it's not enabling us to see about other things. So, the metaphor, the analogy should be quite clear. If we think of the metaphorical lenses we look at the world in, well, there are numerous of them. One is, and I'll give an example of, looking at it through sex or gender. Now, you look at the world through that lens, lo and behold, what do you see? All sorts of very real differences between populations of men, populations of women. And those things are there. They are real. You're not being misled. Only to the extent that everything else is often, if you're not careful, literally everything else is blurred or not coming into focus. You switch lens, you look at something else like cash, and lo and behold, what do you find? You find that the income of individuals and their wealth makes a huge difference to all sorts of things, such as their educational outcome, health outcomes, longevity, reading habits, all sorts of things. And if you look at the world through that lens, when everything through that lens is being brought into that focus, it's very easy to think, wow, money explains everything. That's the key to understanding the world. Just as obvious as it seems to people who were looking through the gender lens, that it's all about sex and gender. There are lots and lots of other kind of lenses as well, of course. Genes is a big one. And again, if you look at the world through that lens, it can easily seem to be the case that that really is the key to unlocking everything. And I think it's actually telling how much we kind of bought into this, that, if you have identical twins and one of them develops breast cancer, people go, how the hell can that happen? They're identical twins, right? As though, obviously, being genetically identical, there can't be any difference between them. Why would anyone think that unless we become so fixated with that aspect of reality that genes put sharply into focus that we forget that there are lots of other lenses for looking at the world which are extremely informative and we need to look at. And one of them, of course, is culture. Sociologists and anthropologists look at that. And the whole sort of rather tedious as it became nature-nurture debate, I think was probably largely a consequence of the fact that different researchers were seeing so clearly aspects of the truth either to do with genes or either to do with culture. They just found it kind of hard to see how you needed both lenses to bring them together to get the whole picture. And that's really what the sort of simple idea I'm trying to get across here. It's that it's only when you have a whole variety of lenses and you avail yourself of all that they can capture that you can see the truth of a situation. Let's take a very, very simple scene here. This is a little picture of a Victorian woman in India. Now, how do you understand the totality of what's going on here? Well, you need to keep seeing lots and lots of different lenses. The gender lens, there's a lot of research which suggests that women are actually more generous and caring than men. This is not just a stereotype, there seems to be some truth to it. So if you look through the gender lens, that's perhaps what you will be attended to. If you look at the class lens, you might see it as this example of noblesse oblige. This is the rich woman, giving some of her leftovers to the impoverished, powerless poor. You look through a historical lens, and you'll see this as being capturing something about a very particular point in history in which the white colonialists were lording it over the indigenous population. Look at it through a lens of social psychology, and you might actually be interested in what are the particular aspects of this situation which leads the woman to give, whereas in other situations she wouldn't. And they say it's actually, forget about class, history and so forth. How generous people are depends on things like whether they're in a good mood, whether they're in a hurry, and whether or not they're being watched, or perhaps in this case, photographed. Look through the evolution lens. You'll see this as some kind of byproduct of tit-for-tat cooperation, which has taken on a life of its own. You look through other lenses too. What about her belief system? For a lot of people would say we're missing something obvious here. This woman is a Christian. She's following Christ's teaching. He who hath two coats impart one to he who hath none. If you're an Aristotelian philosopher, you might say, well, let's look at this in terms of the character and habits of the individuals involved and how that shapes certain virtues. And if you're a psychologist, you might be looking at aspects of personality, which perhaps were there through childhood experience or we're born with. Now, you see, what seems obvious once you step back and think about it is that each of these different lenses captures something of the truth. You don't have to choose which one gives you the accurate picture, and no one by itself can give you the accurate picture. You need to avail yourself of all of them if you're to see how the whole truth comes together. So go back to those studies I looked at the beginning, and you can see how this applies. So this is a summary of the complaint research. And if it's a positive score, more women complained about it. If it's a minus score, more men did. So we looked at that through the gender lens, and we saw a very clear difference. Okay? Let's switch lens for a second. Let's, instead of looking at the gender lens, have a look at the national culture lens. What difference does it make if instead of dividing up the respondents between male and female, you divide them up according to what country they came from? Lo and behold, we see a very big difference there between the responses of people, whether they were British or American. And in fact, the responses are greater on the basis of culture than they are of gender. So the average difference in the responses of men and women was about 9 percentage points. Between Americans and Britons, it was 12.9%. So all the time we're getting fixated on the gender thing, we might be missing the fact that, yes, we are seeing a real difference. There's nothing false in the picture we're seeing, but we have to see that in the context. There are other things that make differences as well. And in this case, it actually seems the culture one makes more of a difference. So when I looked at other data around this, for example, I found that the complaining pattern of an American woman was closer to that of an American man than it was to a British woman. So you can get carried away that gender explains it all when you only look through that lens. When you bring in some other lenses and you see it's more complicated than that. And this is only two lenses, remember, right? We could look at other things too. Now, if you go to this one, here you don't even actually have to switch lens at all. Once you've got that idea in your head that certain things are brought into focus by certain ways of looking at the world, all you need to be aware of is the danger of becoming fixated on whatever it is that is being put into focus by the explanatory frame you're looking at. And in this case, I think you just look at the data a second time and think, well, hang on a minute. 9 times out of 10, men and women are as likely to give the same answer as not. So take the second example, right? In 71% of cases, 71% of men and women agreed that it was morally wrong. 20% of men and women agreed that it was okay. There was only 9% of the group where they disagreed. So it's very, very important then to make sure that you can use the different lenses and see how they work. Now, this is not just important for looking at the world, it's important for looking at ourselves, because the key point is that we as individuals are also a multiplicity of things. That just as there are many truths about the world and different lenses and way of bringing them into focus, so as individuals we have different aspects. So this is a medieval gent here. He looks in, rather than a lens, you can think of a mirror. In the nationhood mirror, he sees a Briton. In a worldview mirror, he sees a humanist. In a political mirror, he sees a socialist. In the relationship mirror, he sees a partner. Gender mirror, a man. In a psychological profiling mirror, we've got to be careful of those. Some of those are like those circus crazy mirrors. He's an introvert. in his own mind, perhaps he's a thinker, and maybe professionally he's an artisan. Now, all of these things capture something about who he is. It's not the case that he has to discover his true self by deciding which of these identities is actually at the core of his being and which is kind of a role he adopts or some mask he puts on. It's rather that he is the totality of all these things. And recognizing this plurality is actually quite important politically. Amartya Sen has written very eloquently about this in Identity and Violence. It's when we come to see each other and define ourselves and each other in terms of just one or two core identities, particularly those around nationhood or religion, that's when you get social division. That's when you get all sorts of problems. And it's only, he says, the biggest hope for harmony in humanity is that we come to see ourselves in these plural terms. That's a way of coming to terms with all we are. Now, that's all very well and all very true, and I think that's good. But in understanding who we are and the multiplicity of what we are, it's the same as the truth about the world. It can't be anything we want it to be. We're not at liberty, just as we're not at liberty to say the truth is whatever I think it is. So ourselves are not just what we say they are, okay? We can't just throw off or adopt aspects of self at will. We can't just deny our background as though that were irrelevant. But we don't have to. All we have to recognize is that's just one part of our identity. It's not the whole thing. Nor can we simply become what we want to be overnight, change our personalities, acquire a talent or a skill. But what we can do, again, is we can look at our different potentialities and aspects and look at those ones we want to develop and expand, the things that have potential. And actually being able to do that, I think, apart from anything, makes us more resilient, actually, because when we come to see ourselves in terms of just one thing, for example, I'm a writer or I'm a mother or whatever it might be, you're very vulnerable. Something happens in your life which challenges that identity. You're left without a sense of identity. So it's very important to recognize the plurality of what you are for resilience. So just to wrap up, really it's quite a simple idea, really, I'm trying to get at here. Just as it's not the case that there is no truth, there are only different points of view, the sort of corollary of that view in terms of ourselves is what you often hear people say, which is that you can be anything you want to be. I don't think that's true, right? You can no more be what you want to be than the truth can be whatever you want it to be. You can't be anything you want to be. But that doesn't matter, because you can be many things you want to be. And the way to be the many things you want to be is often simply just to pay more attention to the many things that you already are. Thanks very much.